Imagine you're standing in a field and scattered across the landscape, you see cows. This is cattle country Alberta. Between beef and dairy, there are roughly 3.5 million head of cattle in this province alone. And each one of them is burping all day, every day. They are burping methane, a greenhouse gas that is several times more effective at trapping heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide, which is to say, several times worse when it comes to climate change. And there are a lot of them, burping up a very big problem. Today, we're talking with Karen Haugen-Kozyra about methane, cows, and how the industry is battling the burps. Let's start with the basics. Introduce yourself. Tell us who you are and who you work with.
Thanks, Mark. My name is Karen Haugen-Kozyra, and I run a consultancy business here in Alberta. I would think that it's probably one of the leading consultancy firms in the agriculture and agri-food supply chain space, and we focus on sustainability, metrics, quantification for carbon. I'm the president of that organization, and we've been around for about 6 years.
What's the name of the organization?
Varesco Solutions, Inc.
Oh, excellent. So tell me, I'm going to ask a little bit about the project that we're working on together, but maybe that aside, tell me a little bit more about some of the stuff Varesco is working on.
Well, we like to think that we work in that nexus between supply chain sustainability for large agriculture and food beverage companies who are setting science-based targets for greenhouse gas reductions and carbon footprint, and then working with other organizations on perhaps how to monetize their carbon in a traditional carbon market, maybe not in the supply chain carbon space. We work with governments, we work with NGOs and commodity associations, the traditional ones in agriculture, and on sustainability frameworks like we've done with the Canadian Roundtable on Certified Beef.
So you've got a very unique and interesting history in the climate change world. Tell me a little bit about where you started working in climate change and how you ended up leading your own consultancy.
Well, it was probably back in 2003 when I was working in the Department of Agriculture here in the province of Alberta, and I was getting some panicked phone calls from our pork producers in the province saying, we've got this company coming out and saying that if we change the way we manage our manure, they will pay us money for carbon credits. And we don't even know what a carbon credit is, Karen. And at that point in time, I was a junior policy analyst in the department. So I started interacting with the company AgCert, which was one of the early movers in the space back in 2003. And it was really much the rodeo in the carbon world at that time. And they thought that if they could bring through a protocol under the Clean Development Mechanism, under the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, that they would be able to implement it in Alberta and gain credit for that. It was a naive notion in the early days, but that certainly got the attention of my department and me, and that started, the whole process of understanding how we might bring about an ecosystem goods and service like carbon under a carbon market situation, whether it's compliance-based like Alberta has today, or some of the voluntary markets that are global in scope and in North America.
Excellent. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper on that. When you hear about climate change in the news media and elsewhere, you hear a lot about oil and gas extraction, pipelining oil and gas, driving our cars, flying in airplanes, heating our homes. Where does the agriculture industry fit into the climate change picture?
Well, they are both emitters, but they also have an opportunity to be part of the solution. And, you know, in my role in government with the Provincial Department of Agriculture, we would always say that, you know, yes, agriculture in Alberta or Canada emits 9% of our anthropogenic emissions, but they probably have close to 30% of the solution to mitigation of climate change. And that notion was reinforced in 2017 when the global conservation entities came together and formed Nature for Climate. And that was shortly coming out of Paris, so just post-Paris, 2017. And they published in the Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences under Griscom et al. 2017 that yes, indeed, nature-based solutions, whether that's farms, forests, and ranches, if practices and technologies were mobilized to reduce emissions, plant trees, for example, that they are 30% of the solution. So they did the quantification globally. And they called it the forgotten solution because we have forgotten that we can use nature to achieve some of these outcomes.
That's really impressive. So tell me more. I'm just a dumb engineer. Tell me a little bit more about some of the nature-based solutions. So I'm familiar with planting trees. I've got some trees growing in my backyard. What else is there?
When you look at the scope of nature-based solutions or natural climate solutions, you'll see those terms used interchangeably. To some, for example, like Shell globally, that has made a large commitment to mobilizing nature-based solutions to offset all of their global emissions from operations, from oil sands operations, and even down to the end of the tailpipe of their products that are combusted globally. They look at that as taking the produced CO2 that's emitted from burning fossil fuels and sequestering it using soils, trees, and grasslands and wetlands. So they look at it strictly from the removal point of view. Others that will talk about natural climate solutions will look at the agriculture, forestry, other land use types of things, and include both emission removals of produced CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it in our sinks through sequestration, or emission reductions from, let's say, the application of nitrogen fertilizers to soils, where the nitrous oxide emissions that come off of that are one of the most significant, about 30% of agricultural's contribution to emissions.
So if I hone in on some of that a little bit, because I'm interested in all of this, but I want to hone in for a second on some of the agricultural solutions. Can you tell me a little bit more about some of the innovation that's happening in the agriculture industry to reduce some of the emissions that are coming from that industry?
Yes. If we would look at the breakdown of the emissions, not including the removals, because that's a whole other side of the equation, increasing soil organic carbon sequestration through reducing tillage intensity, planting cover crops, intercropping, anything that will increase or retaining our grasslands, which are a large portion of our land base in Canada and globally. About 70% of the land suitable for agriculture is in grasslands. We've got that bucket over there, which people consider to be the nature-based solutions. On the other side of the equation is managing the emissions and reducing them. So if we were to take a look at that, some of the technologies that are out there that are being developed are coatings on fertilizer pellets, like environmentally smart nitrogen that Nutrien has developed. So that coating is a polymer that is designed to dissolve at a proper temperature and moisture condition to then allow for the release of the urea and the soil microbes to convert it to plant nutrients. So those polymers are very sophisticated. They're customized to certain growing regions and when that temperature and moisture regime will actually be there, so that when the root of the plant is there, the urea is released. So it's not released during the winter months. Some people apply fall. And even if they did apply fall, if they apply these coatings, they can make sure that it's not going to release until the spring. So there's one whole class, and there's a whole bunch of class of enhanced efficiency sources of nitrogen that also have enzymes embedded into them, like urease inhibitors and nitrification inhibitors. So there's a whole class of compounds on controlling nitrous oxide emissions from soils and technology that's evolving there. Then that's 30% of the emissions that come from agriculture. Then we've got about 45% of the emissions that come from the animal category, the livestock, raising of livestock. And ruminants definitely are a big part of that. So one of the exciting breakthrough technologies that you'll probably want to talk more about is the project that ERA is funding around what is now trademarked as a enteric methane inhibitor called Bovaer. Chemical name 3-nitroxypropanol, very simple molecule. And so it's had a lot of research around the world, and we have a large trial that's just wrapping up in southern Alberta at Chinook feeders.
I do want to talk more about that. Can you tell me more about the trial that's happening at Chinook feeders? I understand that it's almost complete. What have you learned so far? What are the outcomes? What does it suggest for future opportunities?
Could I go back a step, maybe?
Absolutely.
And talk about the lead up to that large trial? Because ERA had funded previous work in that area. So Royal DSM, based out of the Netherlands, and it is a company that's been around for over 100 years or longer. And they started off sort of in the fossil fuel energy industry. They reinvented themselves along the way to be a life sciences company. Their slogan is Brighter Science, Better Living. And so in 2008, they hired a chemist to take sort of a traditional view of what they could do to affect enteric methane emissions from cattle. And when I say enteric methane emissions, that's what happens when the animal eats roughage and forage and their feedstuffs. And within the rumen, which is four stomachs within the ruminant, they are able to break down roughage that we could not eat, for example, forages and other things when they're grazing in the pasture, and break it down into meat or milk, products that we like to eat. And in so doing, there are methanogens in the rumen that will convert the energy in that feedstuff to methane. It's a byproduct of their digestion. And so globally, there's been a recognition that we need to be able to manage enteric methane from cattle. We're very efficient here in North America. Our contribution by our cattle sector is only 3% of that 9%, and so too in the U.S. But in other parts of the world, cattle eat really rough stuff. The rougher the stuff, the more methane is emitted, and that's a loss of energy to the animal. So in 2008, DSM set out to sort of take an in silico approach and hired a chemist, Dr. Mike Kinderman. And he began experimenting in silico, meaning the computer, because the enzyme was the 3D image of the enzyme and its known structure was discovered a few years prior. So that allowed Mike to look at the 3D image of the last enzyme in the step of converting to methane in the methanogen, and look at what kind of compounds could be designed that could destabilize that enzyme. And so after about 3 or 4 years of effort using computers to simulate how well that might destabilize, he got down to about 8 isomers. And then they went to the next step to test it in what we call not in vivo, but I'm trying to remember the term. It's a device called Rusitech, where they take some rumen fluid out of the rumen of the animal and put it into cylinders, and then what they can do is add the 8 isomers and then monitor the methane that comes off from that rumen fluid, and see which ones were the most effective. By far, 3-nitroxypropanol was the most effective. And so then they went on to do, okay, so if that's it, let's start manufacturing some just to be used in experimental trials. And so 6 universities and research centers around the world agreed to collaborate both on dairy and cattle, so dairy animals and meat animals. And the Lethbridge Research Center in Alberta with Dr. Karen Haugen-Kozyra and her team were one of the ones who would like to experiment with 3-NOP. That's the short term for it. So with generous ERA funding Karen was able to do 2 trials to experiment with the compound in more of a metabolic chamber type of study with a small set of animals. And she found some very good results, about a 30% reduction in enteric methane, and some improvements in feed conversion efficiency and performance of the animals, both on a backgrounding diet and on a finishing diet. So on a backgrounding diet, animals are fed more of a forage base until they are ready to move into the finishing diet, which then they're fed mostly grain to be able to take them to market. So she did 120 days on the background and 120 days on the finishing diet, which was barley. And so given her experimentation, we were able to think about profiling that work into this larger commercial trial, because she had dosages that she'd experimented with that we thought we could move forward with, and she had seen good results. And so this was in 2015, and so it became a really great conversation, because the whole time, if you are familiar with DSM CEO, Ficus Abisma, I mean, he's won the most progressive circular economy thinker in the Forbes 500 a few years in a row. And so he always envisioned, and he was actually a co-chair with Catherine McKenna on the World Pricing Leadership Coalition, or Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, for a couple of years, that carbon would always be one of the drivers for this development. So both from the animal performance improvement and the carbon market enabler. So it was a perfect match to come here.
Agriculture, agri-food, and forestry are vital to Alberta's economy, and these industries are well positioned to play a central role in fighting climate change, both locally and globally. From reducing greenhouse gas emissions to enhancing carbon sinks and providing solutions for other industries to reduce emissions, there are significant opportunities to help these sectors grow and enhance their sustainability. Data-driven decision-making and nature-based solutions are just some examples of what Emissions Reduction Alberta is supporting already. To accelerate the future of agriculture, agri-food, and forestry in Alberta, ERA will be investing $40 million from the TIER Fund into these essential industries to keep Alberta competitive and resilient. To learn more about the Food, Farming, and Forestry Challenge, visit eralberta.ca. And so then I guess maybe I'll touch on the project again that's coming near to completion. I understand the pilot project that you're conducting is nearly complete. Are there any early results that you're able to share with me? Any indications of what opportunities could be on a go-forward basis?
Yeah, that would be great. The trial, it's taking place on about 12,000 head of animals on a backgrounding diet, as well as a corn flake, steam flake diet. So this is the finishing diet, and a barley diet. We chose the particular site at Chinook Feeders outside of Nanton because they had a steam flake roller. And if we wanted this to be relevant for North American beef production systems, having a steamroller, it's becoming very common. It improves feed efficiency, as well as they had corn. They were able to get corn. So we feed a lot of barley here, but we had corn, so that's perfect. We could match it up to North American diets and have relevancy across the U.S. and Canada. So the results are very good. We already have two papers published, both in the Journal of Environmental Quality, one on the methane measurements that we're taking out in the feedlot, another one on the reduction in methane that we're seeing in the feedlot, and there will be 3 more papers that will be published coming out of this. So it's been a very lucrative type of study that we've all collaborated on. A number of firsts, I would say. The first is that nowhere in the world has anybody tried to measure a treatment effect at a feedlot level. out in, when you've got however many animals at Chinook feeders, we've got 12,000 head, which is only comparing 3 pens of treatment versus 3 pens of control. And we replicated that 10 times for each of those diets. So being able to measure methane across the control group of 250 head in a pen versus the treatment effect and discerning a difference has been really exciting. And the publications that Dr. Sean McGinn and colleagues have published show about a 70% reduction in methane due to the application of the 3-NOP. And that was corroborated by 3 different ways of measurement, which is really exciting. So the one way of measuring was a single laser that is, a receiving end and an emitting end of this laser going across the top of that feedlot with micrometeorological devices. So that single measurement was corroborated then with a multi-laser, another device. And then we also had, in a smaller pen situation, a green feed system. It's developed by Sealock out of North Dakota, and it's a bunker where an animal will come in and get a treat and eat, and then it'll measure the methane that's respiring at a very local level. So it's not a micrometeorological method; it is more of a animal, feeding and the methane being measured as they're eructating while they're in that little chamber that is or shroud. And all 3 of those measurements corroborate very well, which was really exciting. So I can tell you that the scientists, Dr. McGinn and others, are very, very excited about this work.
70%, that's very impressive.
Yes.
So then after the field trial is done and the papers are published and you shout from the rooftops the successes that you've had, what happens next?
Well, it may be premature to shout from the rooftops because we haven't got all the performance data in to show how well the animals have taken in their food and converted it to, the meat, basically. And then we looked at a number of parameters around the quality of the cuts. And then we looked at the health of the animals to see if there was any odd mortalities or over and above the averages from feeding this compound, because the first time it's been done anywhere at a commercial scale in the world. So totally new. And so we haven't got all that data crunched yet. So that'll be part of the assessment that we'll all have to take into account. I think the surprises that we had, Mark, were we didn't expect to see such a large reduction in methane. And so we are really assessing, why is that happening? We have a number of conjectures that we're throwing around the table as a research team. But in a commercial setting, cattle compete. When the feed is put down there, they're trying to get as much as they can because it's a long bunk and 250 head have to get in there. So we think that they're eating more in the commercial setting, and that way they're getting more 3-NOP as they're eating, right? In a dosage rate, they're just eating more on that basis, and so there's that. There may have to be some optimization that will occur post this study. It may be too early to say, this is the protocol that you will use to feed cattle in a commercial feedlot to achieve the outcome that's wanted to be achieved.
Is there anything more that you want to talk about with regard to nature-based solutions? In particular, is there anything related to nature-based solutions that you see on the horizon that gets you really excited?
Well, I think we've got a tidal wave coming. I do. I think our government has committed to net zero by 2050. The UK has just come out with their plan on net zero by 2050. It's worth looking at. They're going to retire a fifth of their agricultural land into large-scale carbon sequestration, so planting more trees. We're talking about some significant shifts in land use if we're going to meet net zero. And net zero, think of nature-based solutions when you hear net zero, because that's the other side of the carbon ledger. That's the sinks. And so our government's starting to flesh out what it would take for us as a country to get to net zero. We've already heard the commitment of 3 billion trees. So what gets me excited? It makes me a little nervous. It makes me a little nervous because we have to be thoughtful about the directions we're going to take on nature-based solutions. I think Canada has a tremendous potential. And Nature for Climate, you can Google that website and take a look at what, the global NGOs have estimated for Canada. We're in the top 5 countries that can contribute nature-based solutions to mitigating CO2 in the atmosphere for the planet. And they're very excited about that. Nature United has are in the midst of doing a whole study of a pathways for Canada. So out of that global study, they've done a deep dive on the U.S. They're doing a deep dive on Canada right now, and they will come out with a chart on natural climate solution pathways for Canada, which will catalyze a whole discussion. I think they're going to be alluding to it next week in Ottawa. So that's exciting because having labored in this area for over 25 years, all of a sudden it's super sexy. But I worry about the rush to solutions. We need to be thoughtful. We need to consider trade-offs. And so that's what's going to keep me going for the next 5 years until I retire.
Your team is doing some really great work in Alberta, and there are others I know that are doing some excellent work in Alberta as well. Is there an opportunity for Alberta, having played a leadership role already in this area, to export our innovation, our know-how, and our expertise in this area?
Yes, and we have been. So we've got a very large carbon insetting program that we've developed in the U.S. Midwest, corn and soybean, based on Alberta's know-how of quantifying and making sure we have the right monitoring and reporting programs for verification. And we're just going through, we'll be the 3rd project in the world to go through a third-party audit by the Gold Standard Sustained Cert program. And that's implementing no-till and cover crops and advanced nitrogen management practices on corn and soybean fields in the U.S. Midwest. So we've taken all that know-how, and people came to us because they said, how did you do it? Help us do it. So we're doing it in an insetting carbon supply chain, and we're talking to Global Syngenta headquarters. We're talking to Nutrien. We're helping them map out their carbon management strategies. So yes, that's being exported, that know-how. And that can only be ramped up more as we get more sophisticated on this stuff.
That's awesome. So maybe the last thing I'll ask you is there anything else that you wanted to mention or that you wanted to talk about that I didn't get a chance to ask you about? This is sort of your open mic opportunity to fill me with a little bit of wisdom.
It's a good question, Mark. And I keep saying question mark. Cut that part. I think the opportunity for the agriculture and agri-food sector is so amazing. We just need to build the connectivity along the supply chain. We recently held a challenge dialogue in the summer, and I shared the results of that with your colleagues that day we were in the office. And a lot of these programs that Walmart and General Mills and McDonald's and Mars and all these large food and beverage organizations, they're top down, right? They're trying to figure out how they're going to commit to their global carbon footprint targets, but they haven't thought much about the farmer. And so what we're working on with Bayer and the national corn growers in the U.S., and we're working with Alberta beef producers here in the province, we want to be able to open up the opportunity so that it works for the growers. And so the one step in the chain of those companies is upstream on the farm. Let's figure out how we credibly account for their interventions that they will financially assist, right? And we're experimenting with the Cool Farm tool, which is a sustainable sourcing standard that a lot of those multinational food and beverage organizations are comfortable using. And it calculates carbon footprint of an operation, water footprint, and biodiversity impacts. And so my vision for the next 5 years is that we build something from the farmer to the companies that work with the farmers and manage their data, like Corteva and Syngenta and Nutrien with their platforms, their digital platforms, and then all the unique farm equipment and implements that are out there to be able to now connect all that amazing data that's been crunched into the metrics that those food and beverage companies need to meet their targets, whether they're just corporate social responsibility or ESG or their science-based targets, and build it there and meet them in the middle. That's what I want to do, and have those credible, impacts on carbon and water and biodiversity and food loss and waste and things that they're all striving for on their end.
Thanks for listening to Carbon Copy. Rate and subscribe on your podcast app of choice. And for more information on the work ERA is doing, visit eralberta.ca. Until next time, this is Carbon Copy, and I'm Mark Summers.